This week on Pocket Pedagogy, you must defeat Shang Long to stand a chance. Hello and welcome to another episode of Pocket Pedagogy. I am Bryan Carr, and full disclosure, I am a massive fan of the Street Fighter series, and I have been ever since Street Fighter 2 hit arcades way back when. I'm far from alone. Street Fighter is one of the most enduring franchises in the video game industry, originating the modern concept of a competitive one-on-one fighting game and introducing a massive cast of characters who have become pop culture icons in their own right. Without Street Fighter, we don't have Mortal Kombat, Tekken, or any number of other series either. Street Fighter also spawned a competitive scene and a community that is the rival of any other video game genre. Titles like Fortnite, League of Legends, and Call of Duty may rake in the esports dollars and mainstream attention, but the fighting game community, or the FGC as it is often called, is one of the most involved and loyal grassroots fandoms in gaming, organizing their own events like the annual Evolution Championship Series, better known as EVO. The problem with any community like this, though, is it can be hard for new players to get in, no matter how welcoming it may or may not be, because the barrier to competition in the games themselves can be very high. Things like memorizing frame data, priority, matchups, and combo strings can be a daunting task for all but the most dedicated. Street Fighter 6 and Tekken 8, two of the top new entries in the top franchises in the genre, have both made efforts to open the gates to new and lapsed players, but back in 2001, Capcom, the Street Fighter company, actually took its first steps toward that greater accessibility on a portable platform with Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo Revival. That game is the subject of this week's episode of Pocket Pedagogy. Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo Revival debuted in October 2001 on the North American Game Boy Advance. This wrapped up Capcom's impressive first year of support for Nintendo's new handheld. Most of the company's output in that first year consisted of ports from other hardware. Of course, Revival was no exception. I would argue, though, that this game was perhaps Capcom's most ambitious game out of that first year of the Game Boy Advance's lifespan. To start, Revival is something of a merging of two different games, the SNES release of Super Street Fighter 2 and the arcade version of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, which we will call Super 2 and Super Turbo from now on, because otherwise this thing is going to be like 3 hours long. The game primarily draws from the home console release of Super 2, recycling most of that game's graphics, albeit with some downgrades, and understandably so, as the two platforms are fairly close in power and ability. However, because Super Turbo had never received an SNES or home release, the developers opted to implement the changed movesets and sprites from the arcade version in alongside the SNES sprites, likely to manage the overall amount of space the game took up on the cartridge. The upshot of all this is that there are slight variations in things like sprite sizes. As Guile Win Quotes pointed out on Twitter, characters can actually grow in size in some moves, and there's some noticeable differences in quality and fidelity when they switch between the Super Nintendo sprites and the arcade ones. Certain animations are also recycled, notably the advancing and retreating animations. The only exception is the hidden character of AKUMA, who, as a character who did not show up in the SNES game, uses his arcade sprites exclusively. Now, visually, this is far from a showstopper. It's a big game shrunk down to a tiny screen with low resolution, and that smaller screen and storage space means that the animations are simpler and the sprite details largely disappear when you blow them up or look at them too closely. For an early GBA game, though, it looks pretty faithful to the source material, especially when you play it on the native screen where the lower resolution and simpler characters actually work really well and make the action very easy to follow. The stages have largely been redesigned, with a few being completely new and some being borrowed from later games in the series, all likely choices to make the on-screen action more readable on that aforementioned small screen. Interestingly enough, Capcom actually created entirely new assets for this game. The portraits in the character select and victory screens are new art created for this version of the game, and to my knowledge were not used again. They even made exclusive remixes of some of the original music. But the biggest change comes from the control scheme, and this is where things are going to get pretty nerdy. The standard Street Fighter II setup for really the entire series is 6 buttons mapped to 3 increasing strength levels of punches and kicks, combined with an 8-way directional joystick. Now, the Game Boy Advance only has the 4-directional D-pad, 2 A and B face buttons, and the L and R shoulder buttons, so they're 2 buttons short. Now, this is not the first time a version of Street Fighter has been hampered by insufficient buttons. The Game Boy version, yes, there was a Game Boy version of the original Street Fighter II, as well as a surprisingly good Game Boy Color version of Street Fighter Alpha, and they both changed the punch and kick strength buttons to correspond to how long each button was held down. Hold it down longer, it's a stronger attack. They also reduced the number of special moves that were available to each character to accommodate the decreased amount of buttons. That honestly made a lot more sense, though, than what they did for the Genesis version of Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition. While that game launched alongside an optional 6-button controller, those of us who were still using the stock 3-button Genesis pad had to, wait for it, press the start button to switch those 3 buttons between punches and kicks. Hardly the sort of thing that's convenient in the middle of a fight, and oh yeah, the pause button, also being your toggle switch, meant that you couldn't pause the game at all unless you had the 6-button control pad. So in terms of compromises, by that metric, Super Street Fighter II Turbo Revival is actually extremely generous. By default, it maps the heavy kick and heavy punch button to the 2 shoulder buttons, and light and medium punches and kicks to the 2 face buttons, with the strength of those attacks, again, determined by how long you hold the button down. And on top of that, the game offers you an option menu that lets you remap the buttons as you see fit, meaning that you can configure your controls to benefit both your playstyle and your chosen fighter. The game even offers the option to turn on easy commands, simplified versions of super moves that can be turned off and on just by hitting the select button. So, if you can't hit the famous quarter circle forward and punch motion for the Hadouken, just press select and the game switches it to a simple forward plus punch motion. It helps make the inputs more manageable on the portable system's less ergonomically friendly controls, though the input window isn't quite as forgiving as you might expect, and it can be tricky still to get the timing down. That latter part is important because the game is not really easy, especially on the higher turbo speed settings. Super Turbo has never been a particularly easy incarnation of the game in terms of its AI, as I learned from losing repeatedly on the first fight to get footage for this video. I hate you so much, Ken. The GBA version isn't quite as brutal as the arcade game could be, but it's still not a pushover. Opponent AI is quick to block and punish, and even the default damage scaling tends to take sizable chunks out of your health bar. Now again, you can manipulate these settings to make things a little easier, but just because this game is portable doesn't mean it's any less demanding. You can also, if you want to, play against other players over the link cable. That's a nice addition if you have the means and the cartridges and the cable and the people to play with. Combine that with survival and training modes, and this is absolutely a full-featured fighting game at launch on a portable platform that really is not a very obvious place for one. So all told, this maybe isn't the definitive version of Super Turbo, but it's a fascinating piece of Street Fighter and handheld history. So what can we learn from it? In the Play Action Football video, we talked about playing to the strengths of a platform and knowing its limitations. But I also said there are examples where pushing a platform to do things it's not really suited to do can yield impressive results. This is one of those times. Now, this was not an overly risky swing for Capcom. Even though the early 2000s was something of a down period for Street Fighter that wouldn't really end until the release of Street Fighter 4 in 2008, Street Fighter was still one of Capcom's biggest franchises. Porting a then 7-year-old game with a rabidly loyal competitive fan base to the successor to one of Nintendo's most profitable consoles was probably not too hard to sell to Capcom executives. Now, what's surprising, though, is that Capcom took it upon themselves to expand on the base games with new aesthetics and features, even though a simple bare-bones port would have probably sold just as well, and maybe been cheaper. The result is a game that simultaneously pushes the new hardware early on in its existence, while still compensating for the lower resolution and button count of the Game Boy Advance. but it also offers longtime players a meaningful reason to play yet another port, and gives new players options to learn how to get into an occasionally daunting genre. This wouldn't be the last time Capcom used the franchise to usher in a new Nintendo handheld and attract a new audience either. Their 2011 port of Super Street Fighter IV added stereoscopic 3D support, unique modes, and one-touch special moves on the second screen of the 3DS to make a version of the game that appealed to longtime players and new ones alike. Both Super Turbo Revival and Super Street Fighter IV 3D Edition demonstrate the power of building accessible bridges to bring new players into the fold, a tradition that most notably continued in 2023 with the release of Street Fighter VI. That game's modern control system simplified the series' complex systems and inputs in favor of a universal set of inputs that called up different combos and special moves with the press of a button, allowing players to focus on learning the mechanics of the game rather than getting hung up on the motions of how to throw a fireball. It was so well received, even many pro players started using it. This edition was every bit as innovative as it got credit for being, and yet, with Turbo Revival on the Game Boy Advance, we saw the earliest incarnation of it 2 decades earlier. It all returns to one core truth: the more people who are playing fighting games, the better off the genre will be. Super Street Fighter II Turbo Revival is a great example of how the lower stakes and confined space of the portable platform can breed creative solutions to expanding the player base, as well as demonstrating the value of giving those already bought into the system something new to keep their interest. It may not reinvent the wheel, and there are better versions of the game, but can you learn some solid ideas and principles for game design from it? Sure you can! Get it? Anyway, I'm Bryan Carr. Thanks for watching this episode of Pocket Pedagogy. Next time on Pocket Pedagogy, no shoes, no pants, no problem.